Welcome to my presentation today where I'm talking about the terms of a contract. My name is Philani L Ndlovu and I hope that you find this presentation quite fruitful and quite informative for your own purposes. Now, the question that we're trying to deal with is, what is a term of contract? Now, in this presentation or in this lecture, we are going to look at quite a number of things regarding terms of a contract. The first thing, like I've already said, is a question to say, what is a term of contract, or what are terms of contract? And then, still within the course of the discussion, we will look at how terms are incorporated into contracts or into agreements. And then we will look also at the different types of clauses of contracts, and then from there on we will go on to look at specific terms that are often incorporated into contracts, and then from there on we are going to conclude by giving a roundup of the issues that we will have discussed. Now, the first question, like I've already indicated, says, what is a term of contract? What are terms of contract? Now, a term of contract is a provision which imposes certain obligations and certain contractual, burdens, if one could call that, on a contracting party, so that the contracting party is expected to act in a specific manner or to refrain from acting in a specific manner. So, sometimes terms impose positive duties or negative duties, if one could call that. It may be, for instance, a term which implores you to pay a certain amount of money, or it may be a term like those that we encounter when we look at contracts, such as, for instance, a contract in restraint of trade. That kind of provision in a contract of restraint of trade actually requires, or it implores the party not to act. In other words, a contract in restraint of trade usually contains those what you call provisions which implore the particular party to desist or to refrain from acting in a specific way. So we are saying that a term qualifies the obligations in a contract. Remember, a contract is all about imposing obligations and obligations on both parties. Now, so contractual terms usually cover numerous aspects of the contract, maybe something to do with the time of performance, or defining the obligations, or determination of the contract itself. So in summary, we are saying contractual terms cover one, they define obligations, leading the obligations binding the parties. Number two, terms also stipulate the times and circumstances in which performance is to be undertaken, as well as the circumstances in which obligations are undertaken, or circumstances. And then thirdly, the term of a contract could actually determine when the contract is going to terminate and under what circumstances the obligations in terms of the contract will terminate. So we must understand as a point of departure that a term of contract is different from mere puffing or mere sales talk. You see, in the process of maybe negotiating or talking to somebody who's selling a product, you may find somebody makes a promise which is not necessarily meant to be a term of the agreement. For instance, if somebody is selling a motor vehicle and then he tells you that this particular motor vehicle that he's selling is the best in the range, and he tells you that most customers like this particular range, and then you buy it only to get there and discover that people are not exactly amused with it and they are critical of that vehicle. You can't then go back to the seller and say that maybe demand refund, because by saying or claiming that it was the people's favorite in the market, he was not actually declaring a term, but rather it was just sales talk, which we sometimes call puffing. So as a point of departure, we must understand that it is important to distinguish between terms of contract from mere puffing or just sales talk. Now, what you need to understand is that a description of the item or the max, if it's, for instance, if it's a contract of sale and somebody is describing the product or the item that is being sold, that is a term of the contract, as well as the price. If somebody gives you a price, tells you what the going price is, that's a term. But sometimes you find, like I've already said, claims that a particular product is the best in the market. That's mere puffing, that is mere, sales talk. It's just a way of advertising, which is not enforceable as a term of a contract. Now, what are the ways in which contracts get to be incorporated? What are the ways in which terms of contracts get to be incorporated? There are three different and clear ways of incorporating terms in a contract. The first is that terms are incorporated expressly. They are expressly stated. And then that's the first. And the second, sometimes a term of contract is incorporated by way of maybe a tacit, tacit incorporation. We are going to explain what we mean by that. And thirdly, it could be, some terms are implied. They are implicitly incorporated. So by implication, the law gets to impute certain terms upon certain contracts, depending from time to time, and in light of the circumstances. Now let us look at the express way of incorporating terms into a contract. You find that contracts gets to be articulated. Terms tend to be articulated very clearly. A party in the negotiation of a contract may, by clear words and in many words, make a declaration of intent, show what exactly he or she intends in terms of that contract. So we are saying then, if such a declaration happens, then we have had an express declaration or articulated declaration of intent. That's an express term. It states in many words, whether orally or in writing, and parties are left without any doubt as to what is intended according to that particular term that is being communicated. So that is express terms. But when we talk about a tacit way of incorporating a term in a contract, we are saying these are not necessarily expressed or stated in words, but it's based on the parties' true intention, which is inferred from the circumstances, and it's imputed in terms of the law based on the actions of the client during the actions of the parties during the negotiation process. So an intention may be entertained during a discussion, but not be expressed in the written contract, because maybe you find that the two parties find it too obvious or too self-evident, and they don't think that it's a term that they should really commit to the written contract. And then later on, when that contract is being interpreted, it may be necessary then to read certain terms into it, which may not be expressly or clearly or unequivocally stated in the contract. So if a certain term is said to be is seen to be self-evident, then the parties may leave it out. But the court then, court assist with the matter may then have to infer that tacit term from the express terms or from the surrounding circumstances, or even just by looking at trade usages to say under such circumstances how have these terms been applied maybe by in the market. So you find that contracts of a certain class or contracts of a certain genus may be expected to contain certain terms. So whenever there are issues then or disputes to be considered, the court may then read certain terms into the contract based on maybe how contracts of that nature have tended to incorporate a term of that kind. Now, so tacit terms are only read into the contract, and if it is not reasonable and necessary to render a contract ineffective. For instance, you find that maybe a contract is could be invalidated, it could actually be rendered ineffective or inoperative just because of the absence of that term. So under the principle that all contracts should be carried out, all legal obligations to be carried out, the court may then have to read a certain term into the contract based on the circumstances of the case. And sometimes the simple test to find out what tacit term to read into the contract could be. When you're looking at the issue under consideration and you're asking yourselves what answer the parties would have been given if they had been asked about a certain position during the negotiation of the contract. So depending on what hypothetical answer they would have given, such a term can then be read into the contract. Then we come now to the third way of incorporating contracts. That is, we are talking about implied or implicit terms and provisions. These are not expressed in words, but are only they are only incorporated by operation of the law. For instance, a warranty against latent defects in a contract of sale is actually a term that is said to be an implied term. So every contract of sale is expected to carry that warranty against latent defects if it's a contract of sale. But in other sales, in other contracts, you may also find matters such as warranty against eviction. So all those are terms that are then read into the contract in the absence of maybe any express declaration by the parties during the contracting period. So we are saying then these are the terms, and usually it is the terms that come to be called, that are known as the naturalia or the natural elements of a contract of a particular kind. Like I've said, if it's a sales contract, we tend to assume that there is a warranty against latent defects. The seller is taking responsibility for all latent defects that might characterize that item being sold, even if the seller is not aware of them. If they are discovered along the way, and then the seller will have to take responsibility. And then you find that sometimes these terms are so naturally and universally known and accepted that the intention to be bound by them is inferred, even if they are not clearly stated. And as in the case again of the tacit terms, you find that implied terms can also be inferred from trade usages. Now, having looked at the three ways of incorporating terms into the contract, namely express terms, tacit terms, and implied terms, we now turn on to look at some three types of terms that contracts tend to incorporate. We have what are called essentialia, or which are essential terms, And then we have got what are called naturalia, which are natural terms of a particular contract of a certain type. And then we have what are called incidentalia, or those are incidental terms that may be incorporated from time to time according to the preferences and the choices of the contracting parties. Now let's devote a little more time now to the essentialia. What do we mean by essentialia? What do we mean by the essential terms? Now we are saying these are provisions that are necessary for the, or rather essential for the classification of a certain contract as belonging to a particular class or category. What do we mean by this? We have contracts such as sales contracts, or we have labor contracts, or we have what other types? Leases. So whether we are dealing with a lease, we are dealing with a sale, or we are dealing with a hire, or we are dealing with a labor contract, whatever it might be, there are certain terms that are expected in connection with that particular class or category of a contract. So we are saying those essential elements that are necessary to help us define the contract and to categorize it accordingly, we call them essentialia. For instance, when you talk about a contract of sale, you always have the seller of a contract who undertakes to deliver a certain good or item to a buyer, who in turn undertakes to pay a certain amount of money in exchange for the item or the max being sold. So if, for instance, the seller offers an item for sale, and then the buyer, instead of giving, or rather the other person, the other party, instead of paying say a sum of money, decides to give another good or item of similar or equal value, then a sale has not taken place under such circumstances, but it may be a contract of exchange. So it's very important then for us to know what are those elements that constitute a contract of sale. And we are saying there must be an item being offered, given out, delivered by the seller in exchange for a payment of a sum of money by the buyer. Then that defines a sales contract. So the essential element then in the identification of that contract of a certain category is what we call an essentialia. Now this leads us to the next class or next type of terms, which are called the naturalia, or they are the natural traits or elements of a contract. Now let's go back to the different types of contracts that we mentioned. We mentioned a contract of sale, a contract of lease, a contract maybe of service, a contract of labor, and so on. Now, when you look at each one of those contracts, there are certain elements that are peculiar to each one of them. So in order for us to determine whether it's a contract of sale or lease, we said we look at the essential elements. Now, once we know that this is a contract of sale, or this is a contract of labor, or this is a contract of lease, whatever we conclude based on what the essentialia has guided us to think, the next item then is to look at the natural elements of a contract of that type or that genus. Hence, if it is a contract of sale, for instance, then we expect that that's when now the issue of the implied terms, such as we say the warranty against latent defects. So a warranty against latent defects is a natural element or a natural trait of a contract of sale. So if it's a contract of sale, then it naturally has this what we call the item is actually being sold subject to a warranty or what you call an acceptance by the seller that any responsibility to do with defects is entirely his own. So a naturalia or naturalia are terms which the law attaches to contracts of a particular class. They determine the rights and obligations of the parties as well as the consequences of the contracts. Now, in South African law, naturalia are derived from Roman law, sometimes adopted by the courts, or adopted and adapted by the courts to the circumstances, as well as to trade usages. They are the ones that define or outline what natural elements are expected for a particular contract of a particular class or category. And parties are may expressly or they may expressly exclude naturalia. So, for instance, if parties in a contract of sale decide that they will exclude this warranty against latent defects, then we come to say the item is being sold voetstoots. Now, a voetstoots clause is actually an express declaration or an express exclusion of a natural element of this contract of sale, which is a warranty against what we call defects. So the law sometimes restricts the exclusion of naturalia. For instance, the Consumer Protection Act of South Africa, when you read closely, it excludes the rights of the parties. It restricts the rights of the parties from excluding certain terms of the contract which they might want to exclude. Then the next item now, the third type of term is what we call the incidentalia. Now these are, incidental terms. Once the essentialia have been identified, that is, once a contract is then classified as belonging to a certain class, we then tend to have what we call, we said we have essentialia, then we look at the naturalia. So once we have looked at the essentialia and the naturalia, we know what contract it is, as well as the natural terms that go with it. You then look at the third one. Sometimes you find that parties may have special requirements incidental to their agreement. For instance, a sale, in a sales contract, it is expected that the items will be delivered and the payment or the price will also be given immediately. But parties may decide to vary the terms of that contract by maybe deferring the payment to say, okay, it's going to be done in installments, or it's going to be done at such a time. So we say that such a term is incidental, in the sense that it is not the natural expected term, but it is varied and it is being adopted according to the preferences of the parties that are involved in negotiating that contract. So on that note, then we can remind one another that we looked at what a term is, we looked at the methods of incorporating the terms, and then we looked at certain types of terms where we said we have essentialia, naturalia, as well as incidentalia. Now our next point is to look at specific types of terms that are often incorporated by find some of them. We have a condition as a specific term. We have time clauses as specific terms. Then we have suppositions. We also have warranties, and we have a modus. Sometimes we deal with a cancellation clause or a forfeiture clause, or in some instances we have a penalty clause as well as an entrenchment clause, depending on the circumstances. So thank you very much for being part of this presentation. Our next video is going to be looking at the specific terms in detail, one after the other. Till then, enjoy the rest of